Hey up YouTube! Today we're looking at the SpeedyBee camera from Eachine, one of a plethora of micro CCD cameras that exploded onto the market since Runcam brought us the V1 Micro Swift back in late 2017. It's a 600 TV line 4x3 CCD camera and a 2.3mm lens giving 145 degrees field of view. You must choose NTSC or Marlow as it's not switchable. My personal choice is always NTSC as you get 29.97 frames a second rather than around 25-26 frames a second. This makes syncing up with 30 or 60 frames HD footage much easier than stretching every clip. It also plays a little smoother, and the only trade-off is a very slight aspect ratio one. You lose a little height but you gain some width. It comes with a couple of cables and some mounting screws, but there's no controller to change the camera settings via the OSD pins on the back. It is fully Runcam compatible from the M8 lens mount to the width and even the M2 mounting screws, so of course the Runcam OSD joystick or button panel works too. There's a bunch of other control options to do this also, and I do recommend you choose one of them as the stock settings do need a tweak to get the best out of it. More about those in a moment. This was my first pack with it, and what looked really nice and sharp on the bench immediately looks fiercely over-sharpened in this little wooded spot. It was actually a lot less of an issue flying than I expected after looking at the stationary picture before taking off, but it made seeing the white track markers in the little spots where the sunlight dappled through the branches a little tricky to see, and I took a few wrong turns until I was down with the course. This is the joystick I'm using that came with the Runcam Sparrow, and the V2 Swift board will work also. Other options include soldering a small control board between the cam and the flight control that allows changes to be made via the transmitter directly while disarmed. There's no power draw stats available for this, or details if it becomes passive when not active, but it should be in the low tens of milliamps at worst case. There's also a Bluetooth dongle available which allows connection via a smartphone and the free Eachine SpeedyBee app. This will draw only 10 milliamps max and does become totally passive when armed, and helpfully turns itself on when you're disarmed. Okay, so by default, shutter is set to auto, which is usually the one to go for, certainly for a moving camera, and tends to keep a more stable contrast and brightness, but we'll have a play with that in a moment. AGC is set to high, that's automatic gain control, and it usually helps with overall dynamic range by artificially boosting it if needed. And most importantly, digital wide dynamic range is enabled too. This is vital to expose darker parts, but unlike wide dynamic range, which is sensor based, this is another software based parameter, and isn't quite as effective at not blowing the highlights as true wide dynamic range. You can see this pretty clearly in the sky peeking through the trees in the background. It kind of wraps around them rather than creating a perfect silhouette. It does however keep the foreground contrast nice and even, which is what we need. The image adjust menu is where the sharpening option hides, and this is ramped right up to 26 out of a scale from 1 to 30. Dropping that below around 5 gives a very soft focus. I settled for about 10 to crispen up the edges, which it did a pretty decent job of, while staying away from being over-sharpened and creating more noise and artifacts. This made it much easier to distinguish the white track markers even in the patches of light. At this point I became much more impressed with the SpeedyBee. Everything I needed to see was crisp, ground artifacts were reduced to a minimum, and it was now even possible to see the texture differences of dirt, grass, moss and foliage. I'd say this is a small but noticeable step up in clarity from the Runcam Sparrow in the last couple of videos. Colour needed no tweaking at all to feel natural, and at this price I see zero reasons to ever use an all-in-one micro cam VTX again, providing the model actually fits a 19mm wide camera. Flicking through the other exposure settings didn't really improve anything much, but the 160 wasn't bad, so I gave that a shot, but that just blew out the highlights even further. I have no idea what FLK stands for or does in relation to the exposure, so if you do know, please drop me a comment below and enlighten me. The Runcam manual doesn't elaborate on that either, so I give it a quick test, but that just made them even worse and also affected those lighter spots on the ground. Auto gain totally off was also a similar experience, so back to auto exposure it was. Multi-story car parks are another challenging spot for cameras that have been flying, so of course it had to be taken there too. They are usually really well lit, but can be tough for a stable contrast before the sun goes down, as you can see around the edges here. The SpeedyBee does blow out the highlights here just as it did in the forest, but in my opinion does a fine job of keeping everything you need to see to fly a nice stable contrast, and it really isn't an issue for me at all. The focus is good, the colour is nice and stable even in changing lights, and if you are on a budget this is really a worthy Swift micro competitor that won't break the bank. Now I love 16:9 cameras to bits for the expansive FPV experience of filling some widescreen goggles without distorting the image at all, but it's actually a little easier for me to attempt to hit Airgates with a 4.3 camera, and a little easier still if I stretch that across a widescreen goggles. This is not really logical for me, and certainly not what I'd expected. I really dislike 16:9 squished to 4.3, but 4.3 stretched to 16:9 helps me out. I think it's just a little bit more than a field of view question. I think I'll try to cover this in a future video, but there's a couple of things I'm still stabilising thoughts on. I'm very curious if you prefer to fly 4:3 images stretched across widescreen goggles, or do you keep them 4:3? So while I'm far from the most experienced FPV pilot flying Airgates, I do thoroughly recommend this type of camera if you're doing that. So with that aside, the SpeedyBee really is an excellent camera. I've enjoyed using it a lot. You get Runcam kind of performance on a fraction of the cost. The build quality is solid. You don't even need an OSD on your quad, as you've got runtime on the right hand side and battery voltage on the left hand side. Mine's only 5 volts here because I've got it plugged into a BEC, but plug that into your mains power and you've got a LiPo readout. It's a heck of a lot more performance than an all-in-one camera for not much more money. If your quad can fit one and you're only flying all-in-one units, I recommend you give this a little look. Now this may well make another appearance soon as I compare it with another CCD camera, and probably the Sparrow regarding flying Airgates specifically, but that's all for this one. I'll leave you with some tunes and some flying. Certainly not my best laps around here, but one that we got Clinton's GoPro for, and I had the Runcam on the side, so enjoy, see you in the next.
Do you have my permission to film?